All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Did anyone, before we move into new material, does anyone have a question about what was covered last week? Nope. All right. So we kind of ended last week with uh, a general overview of the Four Noble Truths, and we're going to circle back to that at the end of today's class, more or less. But for now, what we're going to start with is to sort of zoom out a little bit and start with talking about the mind and sort of the Buddhist model of the mind, because that is what the Buddha's expertise is in the subjective states of mind, subjective awareness of mind, how to cultivate states of mind that are beneficial, and how to reduce and ultimately eliminate states of mind that are harmful to oneself and harmful to others in the actions that they motivate. That's how we can, as I mentioned last week, that's how we can distinguish between constructive and destructive, or positive or negative, or beneficial or harmful. It's not some sort of cosmological um, edict, or some sort of proscribed moral system. It is whether or not the state of mind gives rise to peace and contentment and ease, or whether it's narrow and painful and disturbing to oneself. And then subsequently, whether it tends to motivate actions of body or speech that are beneficial to others, or actions of body and speech that tend to harm those around us. So, but when we talk about the mind itself, we ultimately we would say that the mind is possessing of two qualities, clarity and awareness. Or another way of saying that is that we can say that the mind is that which is clear and knowing. So here, as I mentioned last week, we're going to continue to come up against English translations that don't quite easily get at what it sounds like they mean to get at, because clear can have an understand, or can have a connotation of um, kind of pristine, and that is not the technical aspect of the mind that's being described. The aspect of the mind that's being described here by the word clear is just formless. It is an energy that has no definable shape or color or size. Uh, it is just an energy that lacks any of those definable characteristics. Um, Apart from the fact that we can say that this energy develops an internal representation of that which it is uh, directed toward. So here too, when we say knowing, we also don't mean perfectly knowing, or unmistakably knowing, because we talked last week about, for example, fundamental ignorance, which arises together with the mind for an ordinary sentient being, and that colors the ways in which the mind can know, as long as mind is ordinary mind. But what we can say is that the mind, when it is directed at an object, it does develop some internal representation of that object. So when we talk about the mind, we can talk about the 6 types of minds, 6 types of consciousnesses. So here we have the 5, the 5 sense consciousnesses that we're familiar with. And then we have the mental sense consciousness, which is added to the kind of more direct experiences of the bodily sense consciousnesses. For example, when we taste something, what Buddhism would make an important distinction, which is that we might taste bitter or sour or sweet, or something of that sort. But then we might label what we're tasting as pleasant or unpleasant. And that labeling occurs in the mental sense consciousness that comes and judges what is occurring in a more immediate way through one of the 5 bodily sense consciousnesses. So Buddhism would say we have these 6 types of consciousnesses, and one or more of these are generally functioning all of the time. In very, very deep sleep, it's very difficult to discern any of these functioning, but Buddhism would say that on a very, very subtle level, that there is some at least mental sense functioning even in very, very deep sleep. It's just that it's below the level of what we normally would be able to perceive. But so a mental event, then, in order to say that we are having a perceivable mental event, we need one of the 6 consciousnesses, and then an object that consciousness is apprehending, and a prior moment in the continuity of that mind or that consciousness. So, for example, if our eyes are closed, then, and we're like, let's say our eyes are closed and we're in a very dark environment, then there's no ability for the eye sense consciousness to be functioning. If we open our eyes and there's at least some light in the room, then we begin to have a continuity of that visual stimulation. And then we need something in that room that we can identify, that we can direct our consciousness toward, a table, a chair, whatever it might be. So Buddhism would suggest that there has to be like, 1 nanosecond, 1 microsecond, something of that sort, of the eye consciousness functioning prior to apprehending any particular object of that consciousness, that you need to have a continuity, a prior moment in the continuity of that mind. And these mental moments where one of the bodily consciousnesses and or the mental sense consciousness, because the mental sense consciousness can, for example, in daydreaming, we may we may be apprehending a purely imagined object, something that doesn't depend upon any input from the eyes, the ears, and so on. We might be imagining what it's like to be at the beach. Um, that could be a particular mental moment that's operating only in the mental sense consciousness. Or we could be tasting something and believing it or describing it or experiencing it as delicious or repulsive, in which case there's an object that's being apprehended by a bodily sense consciousness and then being judged or labeled in a particular way by the mental sense consciousness. So difficult to say that a uh, an object can be apprehended by a bodily sense consciousness with no involvement of the mental sense consciousness, but it is possible to say that an object can be apprehended solely by the mental sense consciousness. So the nature of our mind then is a beginningless and endless continuity of these mental moments, these discrete uh, moments where a mind is apprehending an object. And that is what consciousness is. That is what the mind is. It's a continuity that has no beginning and it has no end. And its function is to apprehend objects of awareness through the bodily sense consciousnesses and or the mental sense consciousness. So that's just a little bit about the nature, about the Buddhist model of the mind. It becomes, it's something that's unpacked in more detail uh, in other courses. It's quite an important topic because, as I mentioned, I think last week, we get into trouble when we don't have clarity about what the mind is doing. When we think that the deliciousness or the repulsiveness of an object resides in the object, then we react to that by, in our minds, validly believing that we like deliciousness and we don't like repulsiveness, so we must consume the deliciousness and or we must reject or be separated from the repulsiveness. And that's, Buddhism would say, that's a fundamental misunderstanding of the process that's occurring in the mind. So developing that kind of discriminating wisdom about how the mind functions is actually a really, it kind of seems like a dry academic topic in Buddhism, but really it has a lot of important consequence for the arising, what kind of mental states, what kind of mental environment exists in the mind to empower or to help to tamp down on afflicted states of mind. When the mind is more aligned with wisdom and discriminating awareness, then it becomes easier to notice mistakes that are happening in the mind and the correlating afflicted emotions, disturbing attitudes that are being energized. And when the mind is when we're kind of on autopilot, when we're tired, when we can't really be bothered, then that's when we lack the kind of vigilance and introspective awareness that helps to alleviate the arising of these afflicted states that are empowered by mistakes that are happening in the mind. So, any thoughts or questions about that? Okay. So we'll switch gears again and kind of go in a different topic, a different direction, and talk now more philosophically about what are called the four seals. Um, and the four seals here, seal means kind of like a royal seal, like a certification, like when you have a letter that has a wax seal on it from the king or queen, then the fact that there is that intact seal certifies that the communication is a valid communication from that royal or from, from whomever, because there's, you know that they possess that seal and they themselves sealed it with their own hand. So the four seals are four things that um, distinguish Buddhist philosophy from non-Buddhist philosophy. Four things that, if you can find these four things, then you've certified that what you are being told is a valid Buddhist doctrine. So the first seal is that all compounded phenomena are impermanent. So to understand the first seal, we have to define compounded phenomena and impermanent. So a compounded phenomena is anything that exists as a product, that which is composed of other things. So essentially, anything that we can touch or taste or see, on our planet, is a compounded phenomena. It's, you know, it's made of elements of earth and, different, wood and stone and copper and, metal, all of these sorts of existent elements that are combined in various ways. It has a front and a back and a top and a bottom. Uh, and so we can say that it has come together due to the coming together of causes and conditions, and the coming, the combining of various things. That's a compounded phenomena. And so, sorry, I always forget that I'm missing the slide on the definition of the word impermanent. Impermanent is, again, another word that in English can mean something different than what it means when we use it in Buddhism. When we use the word impermanent in Buddhism, we mean that which changes moment by moment by moment, not something that ceases at a particular time. It may cease at a particular time, but it is not required to cease at a particular time. It is only required to change moment by moment by moment. So going back to then the first seal, we can translate this into anything that is composed of other things or anything that exists as a product is changing moment by moment by moment. It's never, no two moments in the continuity of any product, produced thing are the same. Any two moments in that continuity are by definition different. Any questions about the first seal? Okay. So then the second seal sounds a bit harsh or a bit negative, because it says all contaminated things are unsatisfactory. But once, I think, again, once we look at the technical meaning of contaminated, we'll understand that better. A contaminated thing is anything which has ordinary karmic causes and conditions as its origin. So basically, anything that is not enlightened mind or a product of enlightened mind is a contaminated thing because it has ordinary karmic causes and conditions as its origin. So if we are ordinary beings, as I am and you may be, then our bodies are a contaminated thing. Our mind is presently, as it's presently functioning, is a contaminated thing. And essentially anything that we interact with on the earth, because the earth is the product of the collective karma of billions of ordinary sentient beings. And when you include all of the insects and so on, then you're talking about, I don't know what the word is, beyond trillions of, ordinary sentient beings giving rise to the environment of the earth. So, but it, contaminated is kind of a harsh, in English, sounds kind of harsh, but just means that its origin is normal, ordinary karmic cause. And unsatisfactory, again, goes back to really the Four Noble Truths, the idea that anything like that, anything that is produced by ordinary, normal karmic causes, are, because they're not enlightenment, they will fall short. They will never be truly, perfectly satisfactory. We talked last time about the suffering of change, and how, whatever we might interact with on the earth, because we are ordinary and it is ordinary, it will come along with its own kind of unsatisfactoriness that will become more and more apparent the more that we interact with it, which is why we are on this quest to always switch, always look for the novel stimulus and only interact with the novel stimulus up until the point where it starts to get a little bit boring, or a little bit, we were warm, but then we get too warm, or we were nice and cool, but then we start to get too cold. So we go back and we fiddle with the temperature again, or we put on a sweater, or we take the sweater off, or, we're always kind of trying to adjust, because whatever it is that we did to react to that previous unpleasantness will always come along with a new unpleasantness that will become manifest after some period of time. That's the second seal. Yeah, sorry. So these are just the... Yes. Mm-hmm.
Is the unsatisfactoriness the dukkha?
Yeah, I mean, that's one way of just that it's kind of it's just never quite right. We can just say it's just, the analogy that they use, that I like, is kind of like a shopping cart with a wonky wheel. You kind of point it in one direction and you never quite hit what you want. It's just never quite right.
So
Yep.
Contaminated means, another way of saying it, it has past karma and delusion as its origin.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so then the third seal is that all phenomena are selfless. And here again, as I mentioned last time, the concept of selflessness we won't be able to get into until the fourth class. But um, what this doctrine, what we're saying here is that in order for it to be a Buddhist doctrine, it would have to agree, or it would have to present the wisdom that all phenomena are characterized by selflessness, by a lack of findable, inherent, intrinsic, self-supporting, self-existent essence. But we'll look at that in more detail in the last class. And then the fourth seal is that nirvana is peace. So here, in a way, we can look at this in different levels, because we talked about lower nirvana last week, being the goal, the stated goal, and the achieved goal of Theravadan practice, whereas full enlightenment is the stated and achievable goal of Mahayana practice. But because the Theravadan tradition doesn't accept the idea of full enlightenment as attainable by all people in the same way, we would have to say, in order, whereas in the Mahayana tradition, they do agree that even lower nirvana is a true cessation. We talked last week about the two types of true cessations. Even lower nirvana is a valid true cessation. So all Buddhist schools agree with the idea that nirvana, lower nirvana, is a true cessation. A cessation, again, of afflicted states, a cessation of suffering, a cessation of the afflictions, the delusions. So those are the four seals, the four ways of being able to certify that any particular doctrine is Buddhist. So, for example, if a particular person was talking about, the goal of Buddhist practice is like heaven or something, that doesn't comport with the idea of nirvana, because it's just sort of a pleasant state. So we would say, well, heaven is not a Buddhist concept because doesn't comport with the idea of nirvana as peace. Any thoughts or questions about the four seals? Nope. Okay. So now we're going to continue in a way talking about, kind of in a different way, talking about what it means to be Buddhist. We talked about how you certify a Buddhist idea, and here we're going to be talking about the 5 ethical precepts that are common to all Buddhist traditions. In order for Buddhist practitioner, to be embracing the totality of Buddhist ethics, well, at least on the level of refuge and so on, and in terms of distinct, because there's higher levels, there's bodhisattva, types of ethics and tantric types of ethics, but in terms of transitioning at least from a non-Buddhist into a Buddhist and taking the refuge vows and the lay vows. These are the common, sort of most basic common ethical guidelines. Okay, so the first of the 5 precepts is do not kill. And what we'll see with a lot of what you'll see with a lot of vows in Buddhism is that, again, they're not kind of just proscribed moralistic edicts. They're training precepts. They're meant to help guide spiritual growth and development. So there are kind of practical ways of implementing them, of thinking about them. It is the case that when we take the vow not to kill, it applies to any sentient being. And a sentient being is, we may have defined that last week, I'm not sure. A sentient being, the phrase sentient being is a translation of Sem Chen, which is mind possessor. I think we discussed that in terms of death, talking about death, because a tree, for example, doesn't serve as a host for consciousness. A tree is not a mind possessor. Neither, no member of the plant kingdom or the fungal kingdom is a mind possessor. But Buddhism does assert that any being that has volitional movement is a mind possessor. So volitional movement would mean that if you observed the organism in its natural environment for a day, a week, and you looked at any kind of movement that happened, if you could say that there were times when the organism moved and nothing changed in the environment of the organism, then you could say that the organism just decided to move at that particular moment. It chose to go in a particular, it wasn't blown by the wind. It wasn't reacting solely to a chemical gradient, in the water. But if you can describe all of the movements of an organism as being solely the result of changes in the environment, like the presence of wind or the presence of the sun or the presence of chemical changes in the environment, then that organism does not have volitional movement. So plants do grow toward the sun or toward a source of light, but that movement, if you move where the light is, the plant 100% of the time will then change and grow in that direction. The plant will never decide to grow toward darkness. So we can judge that plants are not sentient beings. So the precept doesn't apply to plants. There are other ways, like with the Bodhisattva vows, it gets a little bit more subtle. And if you destroy large, ecosystems, then you start to get into, things that are going to impact the living beings that use those ecosystems. So it's a little bit different, there's subtler ways, but hard to say that, killing one blade of grass or picking one flower, maybe we can think about, that bees might like that, or, and kind of thinking about that, but it doesn't break the vow with respect to killing. So to then circle back, it is true when we take the vow, we are stating that from that time forward, I will no longer intentionally take the life of even a simple life form that is sentient, that has volitional movement. So if we do that, we damage the vow. If we kill an insect, for example, intentionally. Of course, when we drive, we unintentionally kill many insects. But when we see an insect and we decide that we want to kill it, and then we kill it, we've damaged the vow. But we haven't destroyed the vow. We do destroy the vow when we apprehend a human being and give rise to the wish to take the life of that human being and then carry out the killing of the human being. And the killing, of course, occurs when body and mind separate, when we've injured the body so greatly that body and mind separate, and then that consciousness takes a rebirth.
I don't quite understand that about trees, how
Mhm.
they're not sentient beings, because they have the consciousness to produce, isn't it oxygen, on which humans and mammals and so many
Mhm.
life forms, sentient life forms depend.
Mhm.
Trees seem almost to have they're part of that cycle of life very much.
Sure, and we need to be mindful, in the subtler levels of, how we choose to be in the world. We do need to be mindful about degrading, the environment that sentient beings depend upon. But when a human, for example, or when an animal or a human, by animal I mean a non-human animal, because biologically humans are animals. But when a human or an animal dies, it's understood that it's not possible for that mind to take rebirth in the form of a tree. Um, and so then when you destroy a tree, there isn't a mind that leaves that tree and then takes rebirth as something else. Um, so they are alive, they are a living thing, and they have perhaps really important biological processes that sentient beings may depend upon. But the death of that living thing does not result in a rebirth. Is that clear?
Yes, that's clear. Thank you.
Okay. So, but then if we do take the life of a human being, we are said to have destroyed the vow, meaning that we've taken it, that we're relating to it so carelessly that we can't be said to be holding it anymore, that it's no longer, we've disregarded it so egregiously that we have to actually take the vow again, which is something that we can do. Could be that a person gets drafted, into a war or something, and they, maybe they took the vow and they tried to get conscientious objector status or something, and they couldn't, let's say, and so they did kill. Then they would have to take that vow again, in order, to maybe after their time in the military is over, they take the vow again, and then they can be holding that vow again. And the main reason that Buddhism distinguishes between a human life and a non-human sentient life, in terms of, I mean, I would say that there's two reasons. One is just practicality, because we're probably somewhat habituated to killing mosquitoes and cockroaches and things like that, and so it's not practical to, like, we are meant to really make an effort to abstain going forward after having taken the vow, but it's such a deeply ingrained habit that we may do it without really thinking. We may just swat the mosquito, what have you. So practically speaking, they don't want people to, like, feel like they have to go back to their teacher, once a month to take the vow again, because it's so much more difficult. And then two, a human life is a life in which, or is a life that can result in enlightenment in that lifetime. So when a mind takes rebirth in human form, that human lifetime can give rise to the enlightened experience during that specific individual lifetime, which is not true, which is not the case for any other, for a dog or a cat, or those minds can achieve enlightenment mainly due to the force of prayer or the force of intervention at the time of death for that sentient being. But that's kind of a different thing, whereas a human can actually, due to the force of their own efforts, achieve enlightenment within that lifetime. So by taking the life, by cutting short that life, you've prevented, perhaps prevented that person, because you don't know. I mean, that person the next day could have become interested in enlightenment, and they could have begun to progress, and maybe they would have achieved enlightenment, and you've cut off that possibility. So it's considered to be worse. It's considered to be a more harmful action in that way. So part of it's practicality, and part of it is that. So then the second precept is to not steal. And when we say not to steal, we also have to look at stealing in a unique or perhaps a new way, in maybe a in maybe a subtler way than we've thought about it before. Because when we think about stealing, we might think about, like, forcibly removing something from someone. And the definition, the Buddhist definition, as it says here, is to take anything that has not been freely given. And we can add to that by saying, by someone who has the authority to, validly give it. So even, we might not think anything about taking a $20 bill out of the middle of the street on a busy, because if there's no one around and it's just in the middle of a highway, we might dart out into the highway and snatch it up, because we're like, well, it's just going to go into the gutter, but it's not ours. That we know that it wasn't our $20 bill. We know that it, at some point belonged to someone else, and they didn't give it to us. So by appropriating it, Buddhism would say that we have stolen it at that point. So it's a subtler way of thinking about ownership and what it means to steal. And also then coercion could be a form of stealing, because it says freely giving. So if we defraud someone, or we misrepresent, or we pressure, it could be that someone does give us something, but it wasn't freely given. It was given under some kind of pressure, some kind of, they felt coerced in some way. So then that could also be a form of stealing. So what that means then is that when we take the vow not to steal, we're being told, we may have held that because, we probably don't go around robbing banks and taking food out of grocery stores. And, but now, having actually taken the vow in the Buddhist context, we now have to think about it in a subtler way, and to hold that in a different way going forward. Nothing wrong with the fact that we had a different sort of cultural view of it before, but now we're saying, my view is subtler, and I'm actually going to only accept things that are freely given. And this has another practical implication too, in that sometimes, mainly monks and nuns perhaps, or, but it could be anybody who's really trying to practice this in a very pure way. If they come over to your home, they might not, like, let's say that a monk or a nun is staying with you, or, could even be just, like, as I said, someone who's really trying to practice purely. They would regard, like, the water, in your, because you have to pay for the water that comes out of your tap. um, they might think of that as yours. And unless you tell them that you can just go ahead and get a drink whenever you would like, or you can take a shower, they might not do that. They might wait to be told that it is allowable for them to use something like that. So, it can be quite good to say that to people, that might just be kind of something to keep in mind, to say, hey, whatever is here is something that you can use. Because otherwise, if they don't have permission, then they might regard that as stealing. Any questions about the second precept or the first precept? Yep.
I took my precepts with my Zen group like 2 or 3 years ago, and I'm a caregiver. So when I empty a plastic container bag, it's just a bag of the ladies' stuff, I always ask, is it okay if I have this? Because otherwise they'll just throw it in the garbage. And I use it in my van or other ways. And she always looks at me like, are you crazy that you're asking about this garbage? And I said, well, I'm asking because I'm not just going to take it. Is that okay to ask?
Yeah, I mean, if you've understood that permission, has been given, and there's no reason to think that it's changed, then maybe you could just, um, like, if you go over to somebody's house, you don't necessarily have to always, if you know the person and they've said, do whatever you want, and, like, it's the training precepts, they're really very personal, in the sense that they're meant to help the individual to progress, to enlightenment. So how a person chooses to hold them is very personal. Um, you know, so to some degree, there's some level of practicality, with that, because, like, if there's water fountains, for example, we can kind of assume that, well, they've put the water fountains out. We don't have to, like, try to find the owner of the building. We can just kind of assume that they want people to use them. They want members of the public to drink in that way. But if we're going to, like, fill up a gallon container, from, some other place, then, that's a different thing. Or, is it what's reasonable? Is it reasonable to get a drink? Or is it, if I have, like, a 10-gallon thing, because I'm going to go, like, is it reasonable to take 10 gallons of water? then that's a different thing. So it's really, I would say, if a person is comfortable, if we've thought about it and we feel comfortable that it's being freely given, then it's fine. But the main thing is to think about it, is to think, am I comfortable with my understanding that this has been freely given? And if not, then we have to get comfortable. Okay. So then the third precept is to not tell a lie. And this is defined here, to intentionally communicate something that you know to be untrue to another sentient being who can understand you and is subsequently deceived. So if so of course this doesn't mean that if you're just mistaken about something and you communicate something that you yourself are mistaken about, that's not a lie. And it also, if the person, if you think that they understand English and they don't, and you say something and they didn't understand you, then you tried to lie, but you didn't actually, it wasn't a complete, it's not, probably not great, because it was your intent to deceive them, but it's not, and we'll talk, maybe later today or next week about complete actions, incomplete actions. But here we're talking about a completed karmic action of lying. They have to, hear what you're saying, understand what you're saying, and they have to be deceived by what you're saying. So, there's gray areas in terms of exaggeration. What is your relationship with that person? Do they know that you make jokes about this or that, or that you tend to exaggerate? Because if in your mind you're exaggerating something, but of course it's an exaggeration, so it's not true. It is not accurately describing the situation, and then the other person is hearing you, and if they understand you to be describing it accurately, then you've lied, because they now believe something, they now think that that thing that you're describing is different than it really is. And you knew that it wasn't that way. And yet you intentionally communicated it as being different than it is. So there's gray areas, and there's issues. And another gray area is in thinking about the consequences of telling the truth. We sometimes have to weigh that, and that in and of itself is also not easy. For example, we might think that telling someone, they might ask, how does this look? How is my hair? How is my appearance? And we might observe, that something is off about, that people in society might look at what they're wearing or how they're, and we might choose not to express that to them because we think that we're sparing their feelings. And it might be, and that could be the best course of action if there's nothing that can be done about the situation. But if it's possible, but we also have to think, do I just not want this person to react negatively to what I'm trying to help them with? If we can think, well, maybe this other way of doing your hair, or maybe the part, the people that are going to be at that party, maybe we could spare their feelings if we're willing to have a difficult conversation, because maybe they just don't have the awareness of doing things in a way that, and of course, on one level, that's kind of, it's not that important, but we need to think about, am I really doing this? And what I mean is that, like, it's not life or death, it's not, but if they're going to get ridiculed, if they're going to get made fun of, if they're going to be judged harshly, we might not be willing to put ourselves in a difficult situation that really might end up being beneficial to that other person. And we might tell ourselves that we're doing it to spare their feelings, but later on their feelings might get hurt more deeply. And so we have to, be honest with ourselves too. But then, of course, the other way of thinking about this is, if we tell the truth, if someone's in danger of being harmed, and they're hiding from someone who is the source of that danger, and we tell that person where they can be found, because we're like, oh, well, I'm not supposed to lie, then we've put that person in danger. And so in that circumstance, it may be better to either not say anything or even to mislead in order to protect life, in order to keep someone from becoming gravely injured. So this is not, none of these precepts are black and white in the sense that they're always to be followed no matter what, regardless of any kind of common sense circumstances. We have to think about, am I potentially causing more harm by following this precept than I would by breaking the precept? And if breaking the precept is actually going to be of greater benefit, then we kind of are under an obligation actually not to follow the precept. Any questions about the third precept? Okay. So then the fourth precept is to not commit sexual misconduct. And sexual misconduct has two types. There's adultery, and then there's non-consensual sexual behavior. Adultery depends upon the existence of a realistic expectation of monogamy. It doesn't require some sort of like legal marriage, but interpersonally between two people, or could be more than two people, but that there's an expectation of some sort of fidelity to that person. So it could be a dating relationship, what have you. But if that understanding validly exists, and what I mean by reasonable is, if a person is maybe a little bit unstable, they might go on one date with someone and then think, oh, this person is my soulmate, and they might get really harmed if that other person isn't monogamous with them. So by realistic, I mean, it has to be kind of talked about, it has to be agreed to, it has to be a shared, expectation. It's in the relationship. And then that expectation is violated. And then, of course, non-consensual is non-consensual. Here, it just means anything that the other person doesn't want. And so in either case, sexual misconduct is going to exist on a spectrum, where kind of like there's a type of killing that damages the vow and a type of killing that breaks the vow. We could say that with adultery, there's an element here of practicality, in the sense that, like, holding hands with someone, that maybe you used to date, and now you're in a different, of course that could upset your husband, your wife, or even just having private dinners. There might be a level of intimacy there that could upset, and validly upset, your partner, and so on. But from the Buddhist perspective, it would not destroy the vow. Only what destroys the vow, it would damage the vow, but it wouldn't destroy it. Only a fully consummated sexual act destroys the vow, one that either falls under adultery or non-consensual sexual behavior. That in either case, only that destroys the vow, but things that are lighter than that are still things that we should abstain from, in either, whether it falls under adultery, which requires an understanding of monogamy, or whether it's just non-consensual. Is that clear? Any questions? So again, adultery in our parlance, does require marriage, but not in the Buddhist concept. It's more interpersonal. It just requires a shared understanding that monogamy would be observed. And then the fifth vow is to not take intoxicants. So here the definition that we can use of intoxicant is a substance that leads to what's called heedlessness, and it has no medicinal purpose. And heedlessness is a kind of technical thing. It refers to losing discriminating awareness of what's happening in your environment, and also what's happening, kind of your own recollection of your vows, your so in one way, heedlessness impacts, because we know when we become, let's say, drunk, we know that we it becomes harder to know how to appropriately react to other people and situations that are happening in our environment, but also we become disinhibited. We lose recollection of other vows that we've taken, other commitments that we've taken. And that's the danger of intoxicants, is both that we stop being able to navigate social situations with others in an intelligent way, and we also lose track of our own kind of moral compass, our own center, our own kind of ethical center at that time. If there are circumstances where we take a painkiller, or we may even take medical marijuana, for example. There are valid uses for medical marijuana, and just like OxyContin and different things, they are going to have psychotropic effects, which are going to lead to some disinhibition, some difficulty navigating social situations in the same way. But the difference is that if there is a medicinal purpose, then that person has a deficit, has an actual diagnosable, valid deficit, and their goal is to kind of bring themselves up to a relatively normal level of functioning. Whereas if it's just recreational, then there is no specific deficit, and their goal, their intent is to just sort of tune out or what have you. So we can't define it on the basis of what the substance is, of course, there's no medicinal value to, cocaine and things like that. But, there can be gray areas where something can be abused in certain contexts and it can be medicinal in other contexts. So we have to look at the purpose of it. We have to look at why the person is taking it in order to discern whether it is an intoxicant or whether it is medicine. And then if it is medicine, we still have to think about, well, like they say, don't operate heavy machinery, so, we have to think about, well, maybe it's not a good idea to do that under certain circumstances. Maybe I should be at home, maybe I should limit my, because we're going to kind of we know we're going to be affected. And then, so that's the definition. And then the other part of this is what it means by do not take. Because that is not universally practiced in exactly the same way by all Buddhists, particularly in the West, because, you could say perhaps that a single, participating in a champagne toast at, your daughter's wedding, there may not be any real harm in that if you're someone who can stop, if you're someone that can just do that champagne toast and then be done, not keep going. So in that way, it really depends on the circumstances. And I would say it also depends on how the vow is given at the time that it was taken. And that could depend on whether or not it was explained in a particular way by the person that you're taking the vow from. I know that when I have heard my teacher give the vow, it always seemed to me that he was giving it in a pretty strict way, that, he was saying really, really very good to just avoid intoxicants, more or less entirely. At the same time, like when His Holiness gives the vows, he's often doing it in a crowd of like 20 or 30,000 people. And there have been times when he has distinguished, again, between like a single drink and actually becoming intoxicated. We do have to understand it to mean really make an effort not to become intoxicated. We certainly have to understand it in that context. This idea of like a single drink, that's the sort of gray area. And again, I do think it's relevant to pay attention to how you've taken that vow from the person that you've taken that vow from. If they described in a certain way, then by agreeing at that time, you're kind of bound in the way that they've described it, in my way of thinking. But it is true that a lot of particularly Western Buddhists, don't necessarily live their life with the view that I'll never have a beer or I'll never have a glass of wine. If you're a monk or a nun, then by definition, it is different. That is complete abstinence from any kind of alcohol. But for what we're talking about, the lay vows here. Because the emphasis really is on heedlessness. That's really what the Buddha is getting at. And if you're someone who doesn't have a problem with alcohol and can just have one single drink, then, maybe it's not the end of the world. But then you kind of have to think about, like, Do you often have a single drink? Do you have a single drink every day? Do you like think about your single drink for hours before your single drink? You know, because then maybe you're using it like as a crutch in some way, and that's maybe not great. So it's nuanced, is my point. Any questions about? Okay. So now, so again, this is just, I think we've covered this adequately before. We're circling back now to the Four Noble Truths, but I think we covered that pretty well in the first class. The suffering of suffering, the suffering of change, all pervasive suffering, the origin of suffering, true cessation. Yeah, I think we've covered those adequately before. Okay, so for the remainder of the class, let's talk about the lamrim and the text that we'll be using for the remainder of the class, which is Lama Tsongkhapa's Foundation of All Good Qualities, which is you could say a lamrim prayer, as opposed to a more detailed lamrim commentary. The lamrim in English is Stages of the Path to Enlightenment, and it is a later effort to organize the teachings of the Buddha into kind of a comprehensive manual or framework for practitioners to pick up and to use to progress along the stages of the path to enlightenment. So it attempts to condense all of those teachings down to maybe 15 major topics. And the commentaries will go into varying levels of detail about how to understand what the Buddha taught on those topics and how to meditate on those topics to deeply mix one's mind with the insights that the Buddha had about that topic, so that those insights can be had by oneself, that one can follow in the footsteps of the Buddha by understanding how he presents the material and then meditating upon it and integrating it into one's own mind. This effort was begun by Lama Atisha when he wrote Lamp for the Path to Enlightenment. But we will, as I said, we will be using Lama Tsongkhapa, who was several hundred years later, came along and wrote several different lamrim texts. Some were commentaries of differing lengths, but we'll be using a very short text, the Foundation of All Good Qualities. And again, I called it a prayer because it doesn't seek to explain these different topics in and of itself. It is just comprised of stanzas that introduce each topic. Really, it's meant for a practitioner who is studying the lamrim with commentaries to perhaps also memorize the Foundation of All Good Qualities and to recite it every day as a glance meditation to refresh a person's understanding of this comes first, then this, then this, then this, and how all of the pieces fit together in a very, very short, condensed way. So it's kind of like the Cliff's Notes version of the Lamrim. It has to be supplemented with more detailed commentaries so that you actually do understand what the stanzas mean. But that is what we'll be using. We'll be filling in those details as we go along, working with the individual stanzas. Okay, so the last thing that we'll cover today is how to understand the structure of the Lamrim. The structure of the Lamrim is organized into three scopes: the small, middling, and great scope. And so these are understood to be scopes that all Buddhist practitioners, from the Mahayana perspective, must progress through, but that we have to start at the beginning and then naturally, gradually, as we actually master the material of each individual scope, and it really becomes deeply ingrained in the mind, we progress from the small to the middling and eventually to the great. Once a person masters the great scope and really truly embodies that, that leads to enlightenment through the practice of Vajrayana, as one progresses beyond the sutra material of the great scope and embraces the Vajrayana material of the great scope. But these three scopes differ in the goal or the capacity of the practitioner. So we aspire, as Mahayana practitioners, of course, we aspire to the great scope, but we start with the small scope. And the small scope, its goal is to help a person to overcome attachment to the pleasure of this life by thinking of just this life alone, by thinking of just maximizing what's happening in this one life. So the goal is to reorient ourselves to a wider perspective where we care more about the overall spiritual trajectory, where we are headed, than just the content, just the pleasure of this life alone. And we graduate from that scope once we actually do care more about what happens after this life is over than we do about what happens in this life. So you can see how, even though we call it the small scope, it's a profound reorientation of priorities and of interests, because that person is thinking about their overall spiritual trajectory much more than what is happening on a day-to-day basis in just this life. And then the person becomes a practitioner of the middling scope. And here we refine our goal, our motivation, and we recognize that becoming concerned about what kind of life, what kind of ordinary life we have after the death of this life, what the next life, or what kind of general trajectory we're on, as long as it's an ordinary samsaric trajectory, we try to recognize on the middling scope that is not sufficient, that we want to aim toward at least lower nirvana. We want to aim toward that as our goal. We want to not only think about what happens after death in terms of what kind of rebirth, but we want to actually think about putting an end to ordinary rebirth entirely, which is where the Theravadan practice stops. There is no great scope on the Theravadan practice, the Theravada level, because it culminates in that lower nirvana. But for a Mahayana practitioner, there comes a point where we recognize that we don't want to put an end to just our own samsaric, ordinary samsaric rebirths. We want to put an end to everyone's ordinary samsaric rebirths. And that's the motivation of a great scope practitioner, the motivation of not being satisfied with lower nirvana, wanting to achieve full enlightenment, but only wanting to achieve full enlightenment because it would allow that person to work for the benefit of every sentient being without exception and bring them all into the state of enlightenment. That's the goal of a great scope practitioner, and that's where we are headed. But you can see how we have to refine our motivation over time, and we'll get into more details as we look at the stanzas that comprise these scopes, kind of psychologically why a practitioner has to go in this order, why they have to progress from the small to the middling to the great, and we can't skip any of those steps. Okay, any questions about anything that we've covered today? Nope. All right. So we will pick that back up next week using the Foundation of All Good Qualities. You can find that in the materials link on the event page, the text of the Foundation of All Good Qualities. And we'll start looking at verse 1, stanza 1, next week. So thank you all for coming. Have a good night.